Well, again, I want to thank you for being at Crossroads this morning. If you have your Bibles, you can go ahead and get them out. You can turn back to that passage that we've been looking at for the last several weeks now, Exodus chapter 20. We've been in a series called 10, and we've been talking about God's 10 words, as it's literally translated, as God spoke them to the children of Israel there at Mount Sinai. He said these 10 words that we've come to know as the 10 Commandments. We come to the fourth of the commandments this week, and it's one that's near and dear to my heart because I have this thing with time. Anybody that knows me would say this about Lee. In fact, my wife has said on many occasions that she's going to say on my tombstone, Lee was late. I show up late all the time. In fact, I'm very excited. I'm wearing a watch this morning, and I say I'm excited about that. My watch battery died about 6 weeks ago, and I got it fixed Friday. And because time is just irrelevant to me, it's just a relative word. Carla laughs. I'll go into stores. I'll look at clocks. I'll go, boy, that's a cool clock. And she says, a clock is just a piece of decoration for you. It means nothing in your life. I am late to everything, and I've been a little concerned that in being late. In fact, when we got married, Carla said to my mom and my dad, it was really my dad she said it to because I get my tardiness from my mom. And so she knew if she tasked my mom with this responsibility that she wouldn't get it done. So she said to my dad, I need you to do one thing for me, just one thing for me on my wedding day. Now, my dad was the officiant at the wedding ceremony. You know, he was the pastor. And she said, the most important thing you do is not what you say when we get there. The most important thing you do is make sure he's there on time. And she kept sending messengers to find out if I was there to be sure, because she was certain I was going to be late. And so if as I look back at my life and I have this pattern of lateness in my life, I have this problem with time, and we can diagnose that at another day, but I have this problem with lateness, and so I've been a little concerned that I might show up late for my own funeral. And so I really think it would be helpful if God told us when we were going to die. Now, some of you don't like that idea, but for a guy like me that struggles with time, that'd be a really helpful thing. Well, God doesn't tell us that, but the internet does, and you can believe everything that's on the internet. You know that, right? And there's this website out there called deathclock.com. I found it a few years ago, and I'd like to show it to you. On deathclock.com, what happens is you put in your vital information, and it'll tell you when you're going to die. And so today, I'm going to die on December the 6th. It'll be a Sunday, 2037. I've got that many seconds left to live. I would leave that up there, but it's very unnerving to my family to watch the clock count down. I will tell you this. When I ran it earlier this week, I was going to be a little older when I died. I've lost some years this morning, and so I feel a little cheated. But time is a funny thing, isn't it? It's a very funny thing. In fact, I would argue this commandment might be one of the most difficult of the 10 because it gets into the most valuable thing that we have. It starts messing with our time. We come to this commandment, this fourth commandment, and God starts to talk about our time. Remember, he started with talking about where do we go in that first commandment. Where do we go when we are in a crisis? What's our power? Where do our loyalties lie? And we talked about thou shalt have no other gods before me. And then we talked about the second commandment, which talked about where is our heart? Where are our affections? Where are our allegiances? And he said you're not to worship any idols, not to make any idols, and you're not to worship any idols. And then we talked about last week our words in talking about how we speak about God. You're not to take the name of the Lord your God in vain. And now he comes to the fourth thing, and I think it's the most difficult of things these days because nothing is more valuable to us than our time. In fact, I remember a day when this commandment was upheld with things that were called, in my part of the world, the blue laws. Anybody remember blue laws? Blue laws said that work stopped on Sunday. There was no business that was going to be done. It degenerated from no business being done to certain products could not be sold. And still today, in certain states in the country, there are products that you cannot buy on a Sunday because of the residual of those blue laws that said Sunday was a sacred day, and it was reserved as the Sabbath, and it was reserved for rest and focus on God. Over time, though, we've become people who have been subject to the tyranny of the urgent, haven't we? We've said there are things to be done, there are deals to be made, there are certain parts of our life that just must go on. There are certain things that have to be done. There are certain things that we can't pause from. And so those things have to be done. We have to go to Red Robin for lunch, right? We've said over time that maybe those things are a little more important than setting aside the time that God says to set aside. And so culture has shifted around us, and the idea of no business on a Sunday is a foreign concept. In fact, in most states, if you ask the question about blue laws, even today, in asking the question about blue laws, not everybody knew what blue laws were. The idea of a Sabbath, the idea of reserving a day for God, well, it's kind of fallen in disrepair, hasn't it? It's been abused and neglected and misused. In fact, most of us in a New Testament church, in a New Testament era, will point to Jesus and say, well, Jesus himself obliterated this commandment, didn't he? After all, Jesus came and he wreaked havoc among the Pharisees because of his activities on the Sabbath. You read through the Gospels, and this is one of those places where Jesus was constantly in trouble with the religious leadership because the Sabbath law was being violated, because Jesus was working on the Sabbath. So we have a choice for ourselves today as we look at that. We have a choice to look and to try to rationalize Jesus' behavior and to say, well, here's what happened. When Jesus came, when the New Testament era dawned, then all that was in the Old Testament is put aside, and God came and he kind of changed his mind. He put these big 10 up, and of the 10, most of them were still kind of good ideas as far as God was concerned. That's choice number one. That's option number one. They were good ideas. But then he got to kind of the midway point. I realize for those of you that are, counting numbers, it's not exactly half. But when he got to that point in human history, he looked at what he had said and said, well, it was a good idea way back then, but it's not quite as good idea now. And so I'll send Jesus and we'll rewrite these laws and we'll revise them. That's one way we can look at it. And we can take the entire first half of the Bible. We can take the Old Testament and say the New Testament is God's great do-over because he didn't quite get it right the first time. Or we can look at it a little bit differently and we can say God didn't change his mind, that God was teaching us something far more profound and far different and far deeper than we realized at first blush. And when Jesus came, Jesus was pointing us to the heart of God rather than to the letter of the law. Now, I choose to believe the latter, that when Jesus came, he came to fulfill the law and not abolish it. In fact, that's exactly what Jesus said about his activity, isn't it? That's exactly how Jesus described his role here on earth. And so today, I want to say to you that the fourth commandment is still in play. It's still just as important as it was when God spoke it. It's still just as vital to our finding freedom and finding life. Remember, we started with this proposition that when God gives these 10 words, when God speaks these 10 words to these people, they have just come out of slavery, and God has written a code, not just for them, but for all of mankind, including us. Here are the 10 guidelines that will keep you free, that will keep you from going back into slavery. Here's what you need to do. And I want to contend this morning that this fourth commandment is as valid and vital today as it was the day that God uttered it. God has not changed his mind. God does not change his mind. God does not look at what he's done and say, well, maybe if I get a second shot at it, I could make it better. Let's look down at these passages or these verses and let's read what God says, and then let's consider that idea. He says in verse 8 of chapter 20, remember the Sabbath by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. And on it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your manservant, nor your maidservant, nor your animals, nor the alien within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that is in them, but he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day, and he made it holy. Here's what I want to tell you that God is saying to us today in this fourth commandment. He's just saying this, that we should remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. It's a very simple restatement of it. He explains it. He gives some rationalization for it or some reasoning behind it. But the simple statement for you, for me, for the people that were hearing it on the day that he spoke it is this: remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. Now, we need to understand that. We need to pull that verse apart, and we need to figure out what is it that God's saying, because Jesus took a different tact when he lived here, and it's not because God, again, changed his mind, but because God was teaching us something profound and something deep. And so this morning, the simple message that I want to preach to you this morning, or I want to give you in the next few minutes that we have to talk together, is this: that the obviousness of the fourth commandment reveals a beautiful gift for those of us who will work through our resistance to receive it from God. That the obviousness of this fourth commandment reveals something beautiful. It's a gift from God that he gives to us. But we have to work through our resistances in order to receive it. I believe that a part of the reason that we have to wrestle with those two choices, did God change his mind or was God teaching us something deeper, is this: that we have this level of resistance to this particular command. In fact, I would argue this, that this command, more so than any of the other 10 commands, might be the most challenging to keep. It really might be the most challenging to keep when we wrestle with it. And so a part of what I want to talk about this morning, or part of what I want to show you this morning, is what is it that God is saying? What is the gift that God is offering to you and I through this command? And what are those things that have reshaped us in the form of resistances to God's directive that we need to address and deal with so that we can experience the freedom that God would desire for us to experience? Here's the first thing I want you to see. I want us to pause this morning and to look at the obviousnesses. I know that's not necessarily a word, but for the purpose of what I'm talking about this morning, there's an obviousness about this commandment. So let's look at those obvious things and let's consider what God is teaching us. So let me work through here. First of all, the word I want you to notice is the word remember. As we pause and we look at the obvious in this statement, God begins the statement and he says, remember. It's the leading word in the command, isn't it? It's the first command in this series that doesn't begin with don't do this. Have you noticed that? It's the first command where God starts with a positive rather than a negative. It starts with an encouragement of what we should do rather than a prohibition against what we have been doing. And he says, I want you to pause and remember. The purpose of this command is for us to draw into our memory. And when we think about this idea of remembering, you know what it's like to try to remember as time passes, right? Memories fade. And the truth of the matter is, I don't know if it's because our memories fail over time or because our lives get so full over time. I suspect that the latter is probably more true than the former. It's probably not so much about my cognitive power, but it has everything to do with my schedule. When when God calls us to remember, he's calling us to slow down, because remembering forces us to stop hurrying, doesn't it? When we remember something, we have to stop and think about it. The other day, I was in a conversation, this happens probably most days, where somebody around me would say, you remember, and I'll pause, and I'll stop all of my train of thought, I'll stop what I'm doing, and I'll just reflect and go, oh yeah, I remember. A part of the dynamic of moving back into this community after having been gone for 18 or so years is I'm running into people that I can see them and I recognize them, and I have to stop and think in order to remember names or remember, how do I know you? And this whole idea of remembering is a pause. Remember, it's a slow down process, isn't it? In order to remember, we've got to slow down the hurried nature of our life. We've got to stop moving forward. We've got to step out of the hurried rush that occupies us. And this idea of remembering, when God says remember the Sabbath, those of us that are husbands, if we've ever forgotten a birthday or an anniversary, you know there's a difference in remembering the date and actually remembering our anniversary, right? If you haven't made that mistake, good for you, all right? But for those of us that have, you know that remembering is not just this idea of remembering. And as God stated this word, it's not just the idea of a day on the calendar, remembering that date. Oh yeah, that's that date. But it actually causes an action. It causes a response. It causes us to do something. And when God says, remember the Sabbath, it's not an idle word. It's an active word that as we engage in this process of remembering, as we pause from the hurried rush and we remember that God is calling us to not only reflect, but to reflect that in a way that leads to action. So God says, in a very obvious way, slow down, pause, remember. Remember. Set aside this day and remember something. The second word I want you to see here is the word Sabbath. Remember the Sabbath, God says. Remember the Sabbath. Let's talk about that word for just a minute. There's an awful lot of tradition around the word Sabbath, and so I want to state some obvious things to you. And the first one is this: the Sabbath is not the name of a day. We've reduced it to that, haven't we? We've called it that. We've said the Sabbath, and we use that to equate with Sunday, or if you're from another tradition, Saturday. But the Sabbath is not the name of a day, but it's actually the description of an activity. Sabbath means to cease or to rest from work. That's what Sabbath is. God says, I want you to remember to cease or rest from work. Not to remember Sunday or Saturday, but to remember to cease or rest from work. Now, for those of you who go, okay, wait, Pastor, I was hoping that you would say that Sunday is supposed to be that day that we do nothing. Just hold tight, okay? Don't get ahead of me here. But God's not identifying a particular day, but he's actually identifying a practice. He's saying, here's this day, set aside a day in which you cease and you rest from work. The Sabbath, when God gave the command in the Old Testament, was observed on Saturday. As time would go on, Jesus would come, he would be crucified, and you remember that the resurrection day was the first day of the week. And so they began in the early church to shift their celebrations, their Sabbath celebrations, to the first day of the week. And so now we call it the Lord's Day. We call it the Christian Sabbath. And so we've shifted that transition way back in some of the early church histories. We moved the Sabbath from a Saturday to a Sunday. That confusion all by itself should tell us that Sabbath is bigger than a particular day. It's not a specific day, but instead it's this activity of ceasing from working. The third word I want you to see there is the word holy. It says, remember the Sabbath by keeping it holy. The idea of holiness in relationship to the Sabbath is not our keeping it. I want you to see that. Today is not holy because you've come here. If we were in another tradition, Saturday is not holy because we've ceased activity from sundown to sunup, or from sunup to sundown. We don't make the Sabbath holy. God made it holy. The verse doesn't say, remember the Sabbath and make it holy. It says, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. The idea of holiness, the word there in the Hebrew language is the same word as a word used in the Greek language in our New Testament. The Hebrew word is kadash, and the Greek word is hagiadzo. Those words translated in the New Testament is the word sanctify. It means to set apart, reserve it for a special purpose. Any of you have ever taught your children, or you've participated yourself in taking a sum of your money and saving it for something? Maybe it was a new car, maybe it was a house, maybe it was a particular vacation or whatever. You took a portion of your money and you set it aside. And you put it like this. I was reading someone this week talking about this idea of making something holy or sanctifying something, and he told a story that I could relate with. He told the story about his mom or his wife, who had, over the years of ministry, had made many very special desserts to which his family would get very excited. But that dessert would get made, and his wife, like my mom, would say, that dessert is for company. Do not touch it. Because she knew that if she just left it laying on the counter, there would be none left for company. So he set it aside and said it was set apart for company. The idea of being sanctified is to be set apart for something special, something, in this context, sacred. God says, I want you to remember the Sabbath, and I want you to sanctify it. I want you to make it holy. I want you to keep it holy, actually, because God has declared the Sabbath holy. And I'm going to point you to that in just a minute, but I want you to see this, that the obvious statement is this. God is saying, 1 in 7 days is mine. He didn't look at a block on the calendar and go, that day is mine. He said, here's 7 days, 1 of them is mine. And I want you to sanctify 1 of them. I want you to sanctify one of them. I want you to set it apart, and I want it to be all mine. I want it to be about me. See, it's the presence of God, it's the belonging to God that makes this particular day holy. God goes, listen, I want you to remember this, and I want you to keep this particular day, this 1 in 7, and I want you to set it apart for me. I want you to make it holy. The simple commandment is that. I want you to remember that 1 in 7 is mine, and you set it apart for me and for me alone, and make it holy by doing that. Now, having said that, I want to talk about why in the world would we come to the conclusion that this day or Saturday would be a day. I really believe with all of my heart God's not looking at a particular day, but God did give us a pattern. Remember when God said, remember. If you look back down at these verses, he says, remember the Sabbath and keep it by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work. And then he goes on and he describes not only should we not work, but we shouldn't cause those who are in our custody, in our care, in our oversight, we shouldn't cause them to work. A total cessation of work. And then in verse 11, look at this. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that's in them. And he refers us back to the Genesis passage. Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 tell the story of God's creative work. And you know that God would speak and all that we know would come into order. And on the seventh day, he rested. And so there's great debate as to whether or not God is pointing to that. And he's saying, okay, on the last day of the week, you work 6 days and then the last day is God's. As tradition turned over, we would say, instead of giving God the last, we would give him the first. But God is saying that I want you to pause and I want you to reflect on something. I want you to remember. What does he want us to remember? That he is God. And why does he want us to remember that? Because there is comfort, there's joy, there's strength, there is hope for us in knowing that he is God. And how are we going to remember that? When we pause 1 in 7, we pause in pattern with God. And as we pause in pattern with God, we're reminded as we slow that he is God. We're reminded of his creative force, of his creative power, of his involvement in creating everything that we know. It's interesting. I was reading some information about this idea, and it's interesting, isn't it? We have the idea of a day, and a day is set up as light and dark, and when the cycle comes back around, that's how we establish our day. There's a time to our day. There's a logic to our day. We establish our months, right, in the cycle of the moon. And as the moon begins its next cycle, as it waxes and wanes through its process, as it begins its next cycle, then we start a new month, right? We do our years as the cycle of seasons go. They fall with regularity, and our years are measured by that. But on what frame of logic is a week established? Simply on the frame of logic that God is God and that he created. For the skeptic out there that doesn't believe in God, they celebrate God every time they roll their calendar over 1 week at a time. Because the only reason for us to honor 7 days in a week is the fact that God said, I worked 6 days, and the seventh I rested. Is the fact that God said to us, follow my pattern. Work 6, take the 7th off. We honor God when we remember the Sabbath and we keep it holy. It's a very powerful, powerful truth that God has given us, and it's a gift that God gives us. In fact, let me just show you, there's 3 gifts in this I want you to see. Okay? As we see the obviousness of the command, as we understand the language of the command, I want you to see the gracious gift that God gives us when we stop and embrace his statement. By pausing even this morning and thinking about it, God is offering us 3 gifts. The first one is this. He offers us this physical gift. He knows our limitations. He knows that we are not built like the Energizer Bunny. You know, we're not built to just keep going and going and going. Some of us think we can. I'm guilty of that. I'm guilty of thinking that, well, the work I'm doing is work for God, and so I don't really need to take a day off. You know, we as pastors are the leading offenders of this idea. Because for us, we have to carve out another place where we give God 1 in 7, because the typical 1 in 7, the cultural 1 in 7, is a work day for us. And it's easy for us to say, what I'm doing, well, this is for God, and so it's important, and therefore, what I'm doing is justified, and I can just keep going and going, and I Turn to Isaiah, where the promise is made by the prophet that they that wait upon the Lord, they shall renew their strength, they shall mount up with wings and eagles, they shall walk and not be weary, run and not faint. And I wonder if God is saying, no, you won't, because I told you 1 in 7 was mine. And I gave you a gift of rest. You're not built to just keep running. I'm learning a little lesson about the technology that I carry around, and my little phone or my iPad. Every now and then it's good for me to power them down, because my technology is designed to pause and reboot. The reboot process is healthy for it. My car runs better if I don't run it all the time. But if I turn it off, I ensure the life of it. We are no different than those machines that we have around us. And God gave us a gift of physical relief. He knew that we would tend to believe that we could just keep going. And God said, you can't. In fact, you're only good for about 6 days. 6 days. Not 2 weeks, not a month, 6 days. That's what you're good for. And if you don't take a break after 6 days, you will break. It's not good for you. So every 7 days, give up 1 day for rest. And God's gracious gift is this gift, this rest from physical labor. But that's not the one that excites me. There's 2 other gifts that God gives us that you might not have realized. He goes beyond this physical gift and he offers us a spiritual gift. He offers us the refreshing gift of worship. See, when God says, remember the Sabbath, he's asking us to pause and to reflect on what? To reflect that he is God. Now, in just a minute, I'm going to show you that he wants us actually to reflect on 2 things. But he asks us to pause and reflect that he is God. And in being God, he is adequate for us. We don't have to be adequate anymore. He is adequate on our behalf. And what happens when we really pause and we look in the face of God? For example, what happens when we slow down and we think about communion that we just took earlier this morning? What happens when we reflect on God's great gift to us of salvation and forgiveness and grace and mercy? When we reflect on those things, it causes our hearts to be a little different, doesn't it? It causes us to do a thing that we call worship. Remember 2 commandments previous? God says you're not to have any idols. You're not to worship any other idols. Don't make or worship any other idols. And his whole point in that was worship me. Because God knew that our hearts were built to worship. Our hearts were designed to be gravitating towards him as our Father who loves us. And so when we pause on the Sabbath, when we pause 1 in 7, we pause and we reflect on the goodness and graciousness of God, and it causes us to worship. Now, let me tell you a little secret about worship. Maybe a couple of little secrets. 1, worship is not music. It includes music. Worship is so much more than music. Fast forward to the New Testament, Paul would write in Romans chapter 12, he would say, I beseech you therefore, brethren, I beg you, brothers, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable worship. See, our lives are worship. When we make God God, when we cause him to be the object of our living, our moving, our breathing, when we cause him to be the point of our existence, when we cause him to be the thing that we celebrate, we are worshiping him. Sometimes that erupts in song. In fact, it should at times erupt in song because our Father wrote a song into our heart. But at other times, it erupts in prayer. At other times, it erupts in kindness extended to those who are a part of God's family. At other times, it erupts in our just being still and knowing that he is God. But worship is our life. A little secret about worship is that worship refreshes us. Worship restores and renews us. It strengthens us. There's a logic to why that happens, and then there's a mysteriousness about it. But as we come together, as we focus our attention on this day, on the Word of God, and we focus our attention on singing the songs of God, and we focus our attention on seeking him and becoming nearer to him through prayer, we find our souls restored, renewed, refreshed. Now, I've got to be honest with you. When I come to Sunday mornings and I invest myself in this part of worship, there's not a point in my week that I'm more tired than about 1:30 on Sunday afternoon, because that's when I usually get out of here. I'm exhausted. My family talks about the fact that Dad's going into his cone or Lee's going into his cone and he doesn't talk for 24 hours. I'm out of words. I'm out of energy. I take the longest naps on Sunday. I take the deepest naps on Sunday because I'm spent and exhausted. But even in the midst of my exhaustion, my soul is renewed. There's an energy, there's a freshness, there's a vitality to me, even in the midst of my fatigue, that God has renewed me, restored me, refreshed me, re-energized me for the week. I was wrestling with this issue this week, and quite honestly, I was running a little late with my production deadlines. You have that handout in your bulletin, and it seems very simple, but I'm committed that when I give you a handout that it's kind of locked in my mind where God is taking us in our message. And so I was really wrestling through it, and I had a deadline for printing, and I was trying to press that deadline. I had a variety of appointments that had kind of pushed me. And so I stopped by Marilyn's desk. She's my assistant. And I said, Marilyn, I don't think I'm going to get this outline done today. I really think that I need to take a little more time and I need to reflect on this. So I'll just take the bulletins home and I'll just do it myself. It's not a big deal. It'll take me probably 10 minutes. I don't know. Not very long, but I'll just do it myself. Marilyn just very graciously said, you're not taking those bulletins home. And she wouldn't let me take the bulletins. In fact, I really felt like my life was in danger if I touched the bulletins at that point, and which makes her a great assistant. And she said, you need to sit at the feet of Jesus before you can do this. And I said, you get it. You understand. And so I left on Thursday not having the outline done, and I went home, got in my office at home, and began to work for several hours. And I found myself sitting there and allowing God to pour in me. And I found myself in the middle of my study time. I had my earphones in, I had some worship music playing as I was reflecting, and God led me to an experience with Him before the throne. Led me to a worship experience. And out of that worship, then I was ready to bring His word. See, God refreshes us, renews us, restores us, and He's given us the gift of worship. Don't take lightly that command to pause and remember, because it leads us to worship, leads us to celebrate Him. Now, while I'm very excited about that, let me show you the last gift that God gives us that I'm most excited about. In fact, I think it's the most extravagant of the three gifts in His gift of the Sabbath to us, and it's this, that God gives us a command that we're to stop performing. He's our Sabbath. Do you realize that? That's what He's saying to us. I'm your Sabbath. Let's go back and let's remember what God has caused us to, or invited us to remember. For 6 days, God created. If you want to turn to Genesis 1 and 2, you can read the story there. For 6 days, God created, and He worked, and He pursued the creation that we celebrate and we enjoy. He pursued the creation of you and of me. And then it says on the seventh day, God rested. I invite you, not necessarily this morning, but I invite you over the next few days to read through those passages and find out, when did God resume His work? It's not in there. It doesn't say, and after 7 days, God got up and He went back to work. 9 o'clock Monday morning, He checked back in. Doesn't say that, does it? Doesn't say when He went back to work. So I would like to venture a proposal as to when God went back to work. If you turn the page in Genesis chapter 3, you find that there's an encounter between God and Adam, where Adam has broken God's law, and God finds Adam in a fallen, failed state. He finds Adam naked and ashamed, as the text would describe it. And God begins to work then. He goes to work not on creating, but on redeeming. It's a powerful, beautiful story. In fact, I read to you before communion this morning, I read to you from John chapter 5, where Jesus invites, or he challenges this invalid man. He asks him this poignant question, do you want to be well? And the man desperately wanted to be well. And he says to Jesus, I can't get to the water before it stops bubbling. And Jesus says, then take up your mat and go and walk. And at that moment, he was well. And if you want to if you want to look at this passage or just listen, what ensues is very interesting and telling about our Heavenly Father. Verse 9, it says, "At once the man was cured. He picked up his mat and he walked. And the day on which this took place was a Sabbath." Jesus was working on the Sabbath. And so the Jews said to the man who had been healed, "It is the Sabbath, and the law forbids you to carry your mat." But he replied, "The man who made me well said, 'Pick up my mat and walk.'" I love his response. "I've been laying here for 38 years. I've been keeping the Sabbath for 38 years. This guy told me to get up and walk, and I got up and walked. I'm walking." That's just all there is to it. You can say whatever you want. Throw me in jail. That's all right. I'll stand because I haven't been able to do it. I love that picture. So they said to him, "Who is this fellow who told you to pick it up and walk?" The man who was healed had no idea who it was, for Jesus had slipped away into the crowd that was there. Later, Jesus found him at the temple, and he said to him, "See, you're well again. Now stop sinning, for something worse may happen to you." And the man went away, and he told the Jews that it was Jesus who made him well. So because Jesus was doing these things on the Sabbath, the Jews persecuted him. How dare you heal this guy on the Sabbath? How dare you make this guy who's been broken and wrecked for 38 years on the Sabbath? Can't that wait till tomorrow? Jesus said to them, listen to this, "My Father is always at work to this very day, and I too am working." You hear that? My Father was always at work, or is always at work. See, what happened was in the garden, Adam fell. In the garden, Adam introduced us to sin. In the garden, we became broken, and God went to work at restoring our brokenness. And this text says that God didn't stop working until the work was finished. God went to work on our behalf, and Jesus was God's work expressed, and it says that he was working even at that point. If you'll fast forward to Hebrews, in Hebrews chapter 12, listen to these verses. "Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles us, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. Let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God." Do you see that phrase there? He sat down. For 6 days, God spoke into order creation, and then he sat down and he rested. Jesus got to heaven and he sat down. He sat down. That's a wonderful phrase. What do you do when you sit down? You say, "I'm done, it's finished, it's complete." He sat down on your behalf. He became your Sabbath. He finished the work of redemption. He sat down. What a wonderful truth. What a glorious gift. He sat down. Our Heavenly Father went back to work on our behalf to give us the gift of Sabbath, the gift of his finished work. No more performing, no more working to attain, no more living under the tyranny of guilt and shame, but instead standing in the full rights of a child of the King. He sat down. Hallelujah, he sat down. He gave us the gift of Sabbath. He is your Sabbath, and he is my Sabbath. All work is ended. What a beautiful picture. What a powerful picture. Now here's the problem for us. We have these resistances to God's grand gift, to God's great idea, that causes us to say, well, the Sabbath, maybe it's not as important. Oh, listen, I'm not sure there's one that's more important, because the Sabbath causes us to pause and remember it's in him. It's in him that he is our portion, that he is our sufficiency, that he is our strength. And so in order for us to experience God's gift of Sabbath, we're going to have to determine to work through 3 resistances in order for us to slow down and appreciate and celebrate and enjoy God's gift. And here's the first one. We resist the Sabbath because we fundamentally desire to be self-made. We have this broken desire that says, I can work at it. I can work hard enough to be sufficient. I can work hard enough to make me something that I want to be. You can't create. I can't create. Only God can create. Only God can create. And we have to face the reality that we have this sin living in us, this fallen nature living in us that causes us to want to be God, to want to be the creator. And so it drives us, the desire drives us to be self-made. It drives us to work for our adequacy. He sat down so that you don't have to work. He sat down so that you could experience Sabbath. He sat down to take you off of that treadmill. And we have to look that in the face and say that's from the enemy and it's not right. And we have to discipline ourselves to the Sabbath rest that God offers us. Our resistance is that we deep down think that we're adequate. Here's the second resistance that we have to fight through is this, that we have this intense fear of stillness. We're terrified of that. If we stop working, then what will cloud out the noise of our lives? What will cloud out the noise, more importantly, of the voices that taunt us? If we stop working and we're still, maybe we have to be honest with our inadequacies. And so we're terribly afraid of stillness. While David offers us this gift, he says, be still and know that I'm God, and God invites us into stillness. If we are still, we believe fundamentally that that is a sign of weakness and frailty. I have news for you. I'm weak and I'm frail, and so are you. I need an almighty, powerful God in my life because I cannot work to make myself what I want to make myself. And that's terrifying. But in the stillness, when I press through the fear of stillness, God meets me there. God meets me there. We have to fight through our fear of stillness. And here's the third resistance that we put up about the Sabbath, and it's really fundamentally this. We distrust God. God says 1 in 7 days, not a part of 1 in 7, 1 in 7 days is mine. And we do this. God, sounds good up there in heaven, because heaven must be a perpetual vacation for you. I mean, you're going to the beach every morning, enjoying the sunrise, do a few cookouts, and then watch the sunset. Must be a nice life. That's what we think retirement might be. God is not retired. He's not sitting on a lounger watching the sun come up and the sun go down. That's not our God. We can trust him when he says, you can afford to give me 1/7. The world will not come off its hinges if I took a 7th day off. And if I took a 7th day off, I keep the world on its hinges. So if you take a 7th day off, trust me, it's not even going to spin a little slower. You'll be all right. But we tell ourselves that, don't we? God doesn't understand. He doesn't understand the business economy that we work in. He doesn't understand the nature of our life. He doesn't understand. When we say that, we're not trusting our God. God's not pointing at a specific day, although we have a day made for us. Why do I think we ought to keep Sunday our day? Because our culture honors it. Because our culture allows it. It's easier for us to make Sunday a Sabbath than it is any other day. You don't have to fight through as many hurdles on Sunday to honor the Sabbath as you do on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. But that's merely a product of function. God didn't look and say, keep Sunday, keep Monday, keep Tuesday, keep Wednesday, keep Thursday, keep Friday, keep Saturday. He said, give me 1 in 7. I have a gift for you if you'll trust me. I want you to honor the Sabbath. Keep it holy. I declared it as holy. Keep it holy. Set it aside for me. Give it to me. And if you will give it to me, I have 3 powerful gifts for you. The gift of rest, the gift of worship, and the gift of myself. Remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. Will you bow with me in prayer? this morning as we close our service and we just spend a moment or two before the Lord. It seems to me, like in the shadow of this sermon, that it might be most valuable if we follow David's words and we just be still and know. And so I'm just going to ask our instrumentalists to play. And I'm going to ask you to sit quietly and reflect on the truths that God is God. He is powerful as our Creator. That God is God. And that He's gracious in understanding our limits. That God is God. And that He has satisfied our redemption. Father, as we sit before you on this day that we have set apart to remember, to honor you, to follow the pattern that you set for us. In truth, Father, this commandment that seems so insignificant in comparison to the others has become so powerful in these moments. Your gift, Father, to us of rest from physical labor, we are grateful for that. Your gift, Father, of worship that realigns us, that refreshes us, that renews us. We're not worthy of that, but we thank you for it. And your gift of redemption. There are no words. Your grace and your mercy on our behalf to restore us, to renew us, to forgive us, to redeem us back into relationship with you is beyond all words or comprehension. So we celebrate you today for that. We celebrate your gift to us, the Sabbath. In the name of Jesus, I pray. Amen.